Hi, everyone. Good morning. Welcome to, or afternoon, I should say. Welcome to the International Biochar Initiative webinar, The Potential for Biochar to Enhance Sustainability in the Dairy Industry. My name is Caroline P., and I will be facilitating this webinar. Before we get started, I just want to go over a little bit of housekeeping here. You should be able to hear me, and you should be able to see the share screen. If you're hearing echoes or your sound quality is bad, use the audio functions in the toolbar, which is probably on the right side of your screen. And if you still have any trouble during this webinar, go ahead and send the organizers a message using the questions pod, and we'll be able to help you out there. And if you really do miss anything, we are recording this, and the recording and slides will be sent in just a few days to everyone who's registered for this event. And if you have a question about the content today, go ahead and also ask that in the questions pod, and we'll be able to answer that with all of our speakers at the end of the presentation in a group. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and hand it off to our moderator for today, Kathleen Draper, and she's going to lead you through our presentations today. Kathleen, please take it away.
Thanks, Caroline. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. And thanks to the nearly 100 folks, or more than 100 folks, that signed up from over 20 countries to join us today or to listen to the recording. After taking a sabbatical of several months, IBI is back with an all-new 2021 series of webinars. Fortunately, this void was filled with many different biochar webinars and forums being hosted by all sorts of other organizations in the second half of 2020, while the pandemic kept most of us closeted inside. Our first webinar will also be my last one. I have found an excellent new host who will be taking over after this one. James McPhail, formerly of Carbon Gold and now CEO of Sequest in the UK, will be our new host. I am so happy to welcome James, who's been in the biochar industry for longer than I've been, I think. He has a master's in agriculture and has years of hard-fought experience building biochar markets in the UK, Europe, and beyond, particularly in the nursery and arborist industries. I look forward to the topics and speakers he will be bringing to future IBI webinars. James will be shadowing me today, but will be front and center moving forward. So James, do you want to say a quick hello?
Hello, everyone.
All right. Before I hand over the floor to our presenters, I always like to provide some context about who and what the International Biochar Initiative is all about. For the past several years, IBI has been predominantly a membership-driven and volunteer-based organization. Despite that, we have seen our membership level grow solidly over the last few years, with even higher growth in the number of subscribers for our monthly newsletter, which is compiled by our amazing editor, Bob Gillette. We have Abhilasha Tripathi, sorry if I didn't pronounce that right, to thank for helping Bob to compile the monthly bibliography of biochar-related publications sent to our members. One of the main goals of IBI is to bring together relevant stakeholders, which includes researchers, biochar entrepreneurs, biomass generators, policymakers, customers, and most recently, those involved in climate finance. We're focused on promoting good industry practices and environmental and ethical standards, which support rapid scaling of biochar systems that are safe and economically viable. Through webinars, white papers, monthly biochar bibliographies, and newsletters, we aim to keep our members up to date on the latest happenings and greatest opportunities within the industry. Earlier this month, we launched a new series of roundtables for our business and sustaining members, which will focus on topics of interest to those commercializing biochar. Our first roundtable hosted 2 biochar producers that are now engaged in the carbon removal marketplace, as well as Simon Manley, who's heading up our new Carbon Advisory Committee. We will be hosting these roundtables every 2 or 3 months, and recordings are available to this select group of members. In terms of our vision, we're shooting for what they call a big, hairy, audacious goal, or a BHAG, of helping the industry to get to 1 billion tons of production per year. Just to give you some relativeness of that, today we're at far less than 0.1% of that, but now more than ever, we need ambition and focus to help biochar scale quickly and sustainably. Next slide. We are very thankful for the financial support of our growing number of sustaining business and organizational members. Although the latter part of 2020 was a bit of a financial struggle for IBI, and I'm guessing for other nonprofits, we've had a great start to 2021 with membership revenues up significantly over January of last year. We hope to see that continue. Since the beginning of the year, here are our new and returning sustaining business and organizational members. Thanks to you all for your continued support. Next slide. Today's webinar is largely focused on a project which was completed last year and was sponsored by the Innovation Center for U.S. Dairy. Over the course of several months, Shannan Sweet, a postdoc in Johannes Lehmann's lab at Cornell, and I assessed both the peer-reviewed literature on the topic of biochar use in dairies. We also interviewed individuals working in the dairy industry that were trialing biochar in different ways. Our report was published last year, but today Shannan will be summarizing some of our key findings. Since publishing the document, we've discovered other folks and technologies that are also working with biochar in the dairy industry, and I want to give some time to highlight additional benefits that weren't covered in our report. Just a bit of a disclaimer before we proceed. IBI is not endorsing any particular biochar production technology or end use. We leave the due diligence to buyers. Our goal is merely to highlight current technologies and applications that may benefit those in the dairy industry and indirectly all of us through the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions and healthier food systems. After Shannan is finished, we'll hear from our other two speakers, and then we'll have time for Q&A at the end. In the meantime, as Caroline said, you're welcome to add questions throughout the presentations, and I'll cover as many as feasible during the question and answer period. Shannan, turning it over to you.
Great, thank you, Kathleen. That was a nice introduction. Very humble of you too. Kathleen actually did the lion's share of the work in this synthesis report, which is titled The Potential for Biochar to Enhance Sustainability in the Dairy Industry. And she already acknowledged them, but the Innovation Center for U.S. Dairy is who funded this work, so I want to give them a shout out. And also, as Kathleen mentioned, Johannes Lehmann, who has been working on biochar research and in all aspects for, I don't even know, decades and decades. So he's kind of the resident biochar expert at Cornell, and I'm pretty new to this. So at the end during Q&A, I may have to punt some questions to Kathleen and the other panelists, but I'll do my best. All right, next slide. So I know many of you are probably already familiar with the term thermochemical conversion and exactly what it is, but just for anyone who's maybe new to the world of biochar and TCC, I'll give a quick overview, very quick, one slide, of thermochemical conversion, briefly talk about the difference between pyrolysis and gasification, and then the rest of my presentation is going to focus on biochar and pyrolysis and how they can benefit dairy farms, particularly focused right now in New York State, where we're trying to launch a project through NYSERDA to locate on a dairy farm and do on-farm pyrolysis and do some more research. But this is an area of research, as you all know, that is going on around the world, and a lot of pyrolysis and biochar sort of research on dairies has been done in Australia and Europe and so on. All right, next slide. So thermochemical conversion, what is it? It's basically a bunch of different techniques that use high heat and little or no oxygen to convert organic matter into gases, liquids, and solids. There's different technologies that are capable of carbonizing this organic material, but the most common are pyrolysis and gasification. The other panelists are going to talk more about gasification, so I'll be focusing more on pyrolysis today. But quickly, I will say that gasification tends to use really high heat, like upwards of 1,000 degrees Celsius, and it creates gases that can be used as an energy source, but it doesn't create much biochar, which is the solid sort of carbon-rich byproduct of thermochemical conversion that decomposes more slowly than the original biomass. And the original biomass can be really just about any organic material. It can be crop residues, viticultural residues, woody mass. It can even be dairy manure, as long as it's pretty dry, relatively speaking. It can be human manure. So pretty much any organic material can be pyrolyzed. So gasification uses super high heat, doesn't create too much biochar, but pyrolysis still uses high heat. And I should mention gasification incorporates just a little bit of oxygen. Pyrolysis does not. So this is done with no oxygen and high heat, but not as high usually as gasification, usually more like between 300 and 700 degrees Celsius. And this, although it doesn't produce as many gases and liquids, it produces more biochar. And in general, pyrolysis could be useful, I guess, on dairy farms for that reason, because biochar itself can be useful as a byproduct to be used on dairy farms. But that said, gasification can also be a great way to deal with manure management issues that dairy farms might face. So, for instance, both thermochemical conversion techniques can reduce the volume of manure, increase the speed of processing, immobilize heavy metals, reduce toxins and odors that are usually associated with manure. Next. So just so you can sort of visualize what one specific machine or process might look like as I continue talking about pyrolysis and biochar on dairy farms, this is just a little visual example. As Kathleen said, we're not promoting any specific companies here, but this is one company called Biomass Controls that works, they're out of Connecticut, and they work with another company called Native Energy out of Vermont. And this machine is an example of an on-farm pyrolysis kiln that they have on a farm in Connecticut. And I think the farm has about 1,500 milking cows, and they're sort of just doing an experiment and mass energy balance work and seeing like how effective this machine is at processing dairy manure. So they're able to process about manure from about 200 cows with this. And in the schematics, just to give you a sense of like how it works, they collect the manure from a storage pit that's below the milking barn. So this is all the manure, the liquids, maybe any bedding that might be mixed in, the solids, everything. And then that's sent to a separator shed or maybe a storage shed. And then they screw press it. So that reduces the moisture from about 90% to between 60 to 65%. And then they take the separated solids from there and use it either for bedding or pyrolyze it. So when they pyrolyze it, it creates a little bit of excess energy, and they use that excess energy to dry the separated solids even more. Because when you, right now, the current technology with pyrolysis requires the feedstock or the organic matter that's being put in to be between 10 to 15% moisture content. And when this machine is running full time, it can produce about 1 cubic meter of biochar per day from 5 cubic meters of dewatered manure. Next slide. Okay, so now that you know, maybe, hopefully, as well.
Sorry about that.
No, that's okay. I can keep talking. Now that you know kind of what thermochemical conversion is, and specifically pyrolysis, I'm going to spend and you have a sense, maybe you can visualize in your mind now what the process is like on an actual dairy farm. I'll talk the rest of the time about the benefits and uses of biochar on dairy farms. And there are a myriad of them. I won't be able to talk about all of them. So if you really are excited about this, I'll encourage you at the end to check out that synthesis report that Kathleen and I worked on. But just quickly, and for all of these topics, I'll have a slide that goes into a little more detail. But as I mentioned previously, thermochemical conversion is a great manure management strategy in terms of volume reduction and more. Also, biochar can be beneficial for cow health and water quality. There's other benefits that include like composting and anaerobic digestion. I'll get into that towards the end. And biochar can also help, the use and production can help address climate change issues on and off farm, and have some positive energy benefits that I think the other panelists will probably get into more details about. Next slide. So yes, manure management, the elephant in the room. So I think hopefully there's some farmers on this webinar today, but I think other people besides farmers realize that larger dairy operations are going to increasingly be required to provide manure storage that's capable of containing a lot of manure during times of the year when they're not permitted to be spreading it. So I know some states already are really cracking down on spreading during inappropriate times. And so they're going to need to store more and more. And even if you, like, a lot of farms maybe think they have enough storage, with increasing heavy rainfall events and other issues related to climate change, even really large manure storage structures can be threatened. So reducing the volume of manure on dairies is super, super important. And pyrolysis can reduce the volume of the separated solids I mentioned before by 75 to 95%. Now, granted, this is not the liquid manure, these are the separated solids, but that's still significant. So that big range, that 20% range, depends on the temperature. So if you pyrolyze at higher temperatures, you're going to reduce the volume more. Also, this pyrolysis creates a really useful byproduct, biochar. So not only have you reduced the volume by pyrolyzing, you can add the biochar to the liquid portion of the dairy manure that is being spread on the land, and that has a lot of benefits. So for instance, biochar made from nutrient-rich feedstock, like dairy manure, has condensed amounts of nutrients, specifically phosphorus and potassium, which are important to crop growth. So basically, you're reducing the volume, but you're keeping all of that phosphorus, so it's just really condensed. A lot of the nitrogen ends up being burned off, a little bit remains, but still, if you combine this biochar that you've made with nitrogen fertilizer that's purchased, the efficiency of the fertilizer actually improves. So you get higher yields, and you don't need to use as much fertilizer. Also, most biochars have a strong surface charge, so that actually helps hold nutrients in the soil while they're still available to plants for uptake. So essentially, you're going to have more efficient and effective fertilizers and less runoff, because the biochar helps sort of let those nutrients cling to the soils. So less nutrient leaching, which means less fertilizer needs to be applied. And lastly, adding biochar to a dairy manure slurry pit or other areas where liquid manure is stored can reduce odor emissions. Next slide. So here's one example of that, where this farm in Vermont, Shelburne Farm, used biochar to reduce odors from their manure slurry pit. So they spread a big truckload of biochar on this 1,300 cubic meter slurry pit, or manure slurry pit, and they immediately noticed reductions in odors after the biochar started to develop a cake on the top. And this wasn't, they kind of are not quite a research farm. They're an operational dairy, but they do a lot of research and experimentation. And although this wasn't a peer-reviewed study, the farm management definitely saw that biochar reduced the odors, and they're going to continue doing this in the future. And the reason it works is because the biochar creates a barrier that reduces the volatilization of ammonia and other odors. And I know, after having interviewed and spoken with a lot of farmers in New York State and elsewhere, that odor is super important for dairy farms. They're a part of the community. They don't want to upset or offend anyone, the neighbors. So this could be like a really important use of biochar. And I should mention too, this farm had to truck in the biochar from Canada. So, I mean, how convenient would it be if you could just produce the biochar on your own dairy farm with your own dairy manure and then use it to help with odor issues. Next slide. So also, studies have found that adding small amounts of biochar to animal feedstock can improve herd health. A lot of work has been done in Europe and elsewhere, not much research in the US yet, because the FDA makes you jump through a lot of hoops with that. But yeah, elsewhere they found you could actually make biochar with the dairy manure and then reincorporate that into feed. And early findings doing this sort of research suggests that when biochar is added to feed, and it can be other biochar too, it could be woody biomass or crop residues, but when it's added to the feed, the cows finish eating earlier. The farms tend to have lower vet bills. There is a reduced reliance on pharmaceuticals and disinfectants, and the methane emissions from cows is reduced. So when you add biochar to the feedstock, the cows essentially are less flatulent, they fart less, so you reduce methane emissions. Also, biochar, kind of like activated carbon, can act as a binder in feed. So it reduces certain mycotoxins that can be found sometimes in animal feed, and that can contaminate the milk and meat. Now, not a lot of studies, or not a lot of really rigorous studies, have been done that compare the use of biochar in dairy bedding to other current bedding options like sand or sawdust or lime or gypsum. But some research has been done, and a lot of just use on farms has been done. And so there's sort of just this sort of common sense research, I guess you might call it. So some of these quote unquote on-farm experiments have shown that using biochar as a component of bedding could lead to a bunch of benefits, including reduced odors, which is sort of related to what I just talked about with the slurry pit, drier stalls, improved hoof health, and also some farms that have tried incorporating biochar into their bedding noticed a reduction in mastitis. So the farms would essentially have improved milk quality, which means you will make more money. All right, next. Okay, so the next couple slides, I'm going to talk about some of the environmental benefits of incorporating pyrolysis and biochar use on dairy farms. So when you pyrolyze dairy manure, it immobilizes some of the toxic metals that are usually present in the manure, like cadmium, copper, and zinc. And the process also makes nutrients more stable. So I mentioned this earlier. There's still plants available, like phosphorus, etc. The plant can still take them up readily, but they're less water soluble. And this is super important as harmful algal blooms and other issues come up around the country, around the world. So yeah, pyrolysis sort of immobilizes and stabilizes some things that can tend to run off into groundwater and nearby water bodies. Biochar can also help filter stormwater and runoff in general when it's applied to the soil. So remember I said that the surface tends to be charged and charred actually on biochar, and this helps it to sort of hold on to the nutrients. Again, still plant available, but they're less likely to run off. So one good example is you can incorporate biochar around silage storage areas, which tend to leach a lot of nitrogen and phosphorus and potassium and other nutrients. And this will help filter that silage runoff water, and those nutrients will adhere to the biochar charged soil. And then you could basically make little bioswales, and you can also use it as sort of a charcoal-y filter and then incorporate that onto your land where you're growing crops when necessary. So basically all of these traits, the immobilization, the stabilization, the filtration, means that both making, so pyrolyzing, and using biochar can reduce groundwater contamination and eutrophication of nearby water bodies. Next slide. So, climate change. I think with our new administration, we're going to see climate change become a really large political goal of President Biden's. Even years ago, before he was running, he always talked about addressing climate change and particularly focusing on farms and soils, because he saw great potential in agriculture to store carbon in the soil. It covers a lot of land, and you know there's other things you can do on farms to reduce carbon emissions, including changing tillage and such. But biochar particularly has been recognized by the IPCC and other organizations as a carbon sequestration technique. And also, we mentioned this in the synthesis report, the US dairy industry launched a net zero initiative, net zero meaning carbon emissions, with the objective of becoming carbon neutral or even carbon negative by the year 2050, which is practically around the corner. And so thermochemical conversion and biochar, particularly on dairies, can help reach this goal. So making and using biochar definitely will help us address climate change, and that's why people like Biden and his administration and the IPCC have recognized it as a way to address climate change. So for instance, biochar itself makes the carbon in the original feedstock more stable and less likely to break down quickly. So I mentioned this at the very beginning. Say you have a certain amount of carbon in the dairy manure that you want to pyrolyze. That carbon is going, if it's just spread on the land, is going to break down relatively quickly and then be released into the atmosphere as, you know, carbon dioxide or methane. But if you turn it into biochar, that carbon can be sequestered or stabilized for decades to millennia. So you're still adding good organic material over time to your soils, your dairy soils, but this carbon isn't going to be going back into the atmosphere for a long, long time. Also, I just mentioned this, as a feed additive, biochar can reduce methane emissions from cows directly. Essentially, they fart less when it's added to their feed. And it can indirectly reduce soil emissions after having hatched through the cow's rumen and is applied to the land. So I'm not talking about just applying the biochar itself. I'm talking about it has already gone through the cow's digestive system. It actually makes a difference still. Also, as I mentioned in the beginning, thermochemical conversion can actually create gases that can be used to create energy, or heat to create energy, and that can be used on the farm to run all sorts of processes, heating, cooling, other stuff. The other panelists will talk more about that. But when I showed that schematic, I mentioned that kiln, that pyrolysis kiln that pyrolyzes the dairy manure solids, creates enough energy to dry the manure to a certain stage before the pyrolysis actually happens. So it's sort of this like closed system. So I'll stop there and let my colleagues talk a little bit more about the energy and stuff. But essentially, you can consider it to be like a renewable source of energy. Biochar also can reduce other greenhouse gas emissions like nitrous oxides and carbon dioxide. So essentially, this could be a climate mitigation step on dairy farms. And don't quote me on this, but I feel like the current administration is probably looking to give carbon credits or some sort of credit or something to industries, farmers who start to work on climate mitigation. And then also climate adaptation is important because, like it or not, the climate is still gonna keep changing a bit. So we might see extreme weather conditions like droughts and floods hit different parts of the world more. And once again, biochar can help address this. So because biochar has large pore sizes and it's stable, as I mentioned, in the soil, it can provide a long-term positive impact on soil water holding capacity. And this can help with water retention during drought periods. And then on the flip side, depending on the type of biochar and the soil type, when biochar is added to the soil, it can also improve soil porosity and water infiltration. And that would help farmers adapt to heavy rainfall and flooding events. Next slide. Okay, lastly, this is the last slide. I have a few other benefits of pyrolysis and biochar use on dairy farms that didn't really neatly fit into the other categories I mentioned, but I think they relate to all of them in terms of water quality, climate change, cow health, manure management, etc. So one additional benefit is in composting on dairy farms. So when you add biochar to a compost pile at the beginning of the process, it speeds up the heating process and increases beneficial microbial growth. And that's because biochar is just, it makes these nice little habitats for good microbes. And then that, so speeds up heating, good for microbial growth, that ultimately speeds up the decomposition process and the composting process overall. And other research suggests that co-composting with biochar can also increase the nutrient retention from the compost. Because remember, nutrients like to adhere to the surface of biochar. It can also, as we've mentioned in other areas like the slurry pits and addition to feed, etc., it can reduce the methane, nitrous oxide, and ammonia gases that are emitted from the composting process. And lastly, another benefit that can be derived from using biochar on dairy farms can come from incorporating it into the anaerobic digestion process. So anaerobic digestion on dairy farms is used to create energy via methane production. So if you add biochar to the anaerobic digester, or the dairy manure that's being digested, it can increase the methane production by 25%. So you're getting that much more renewable energy. And it can decrease the lag phase from 2 to 1.5 days during the digestion process. And I know half a day doesn't sound like a whole lot, but if you think about, the course of a year or years, that can really add up. And then another benefit of using biochar in the anaerobic digestion process is that it reduces the emission of hydrogen sulfide. So that actually improves the biogas quality, and it reduces wear and tear on the equipment. Next slide. All right, so I'm going to finish up. I wasn't sure if this presentation would be shared with everyone, but now I know it will be. So you'll be able to click on the link to get this full synthesis report if you're super excited about everything I just mentioned. The report's, I think, like 24 pages, so it goes into much greater detail than I did, and more examples, and there's references, and it's really reader friendly. Kathleen did an awesome job. So you'll get the link, but if you're dying to read it immediately, you can just Google the title there. And then feel free to contact myself, of course, Kathleen, or Johannes Lehmann, my mentor, if you have questions about this presentation, this work, or really anything biochar related. And also feel free to visit our pyrolysis website at Cornell. We have a kiln that's unfortunately hasn't been run in a while because of COVID, but we have a website sort of dedicated to that. And I update things like this, webinars, seminars, papers on it. So that's a good website to check out. And then also the Ithaca Institute, that's who Kathleen works with. And with that, I will hand it back over to Kathleen. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Shannan. I think you underestimate how much work you've been doing in this industry. She's had a lot of discussions with New York State dairy farmers, which I think is what we all need to be doing in the biochar space to really understand what problems they have that biochar may be able to solve. So one last thing I wanted to mention on the compost side, this has come up within the US Biochar Initiative discussions in the last couple of weeks, is it's also being used to immobilize toxins found in manures. So the compost industry is quite interested in using biochar because they have certain toxins, and I can't remember what they're called, but they have to do with herbicides and pesticides that are in the feed that horses and cows are being fed, and it passes right through the animal. But they're finding that a certain amount, not too much biochar, can actually help immobilize those toxins so that they're not taken up by plants from the compost. So lots of different benefits there. And thanks again, Shannan. So next up is Greg Campbell. He is the CEO of a company called VGrid Energy Systems, and he's going to tell us about how their technology has been working with dairy farmers in California. Greg, you're up.
Great. Thank you so much, Kathleen, for organizing this webinar. I think it's both very interesting and important. And thank you so much, Shannan. You just did a great job and made my job, frankly, a lot easier. So I really appreciate that. At VGrid, we're focused on what we call the 3P climate change solution. And we do that through producing clean renewable energy and valuable high surface area. We call it biocarbon. It's also known as biochar. And we prevent greenhouse gases by both reducing them as well as removing them. And I'll talk a little bit about that. And we promote a better quality of life for both animals and for humans using those biocarbon solutions. Can I get the next slide? Next one. I want to just touch on this a moment because Shannan talked about carbon negative. So carbon positive is when we burn fossil fuels, which we drill out of the ground and burn them and produce CO2 that we put into the atmosphere. Wind, solar, and hydro, we call carbon neutral. They don't emit CO2, but they also don't remove CO2 from the atmosphere. Whereas carbon negative uses the fact that trees and plants, through the process of photosynthesis, convert CO2 into oxygen, and that carbon is stored in the tree or plant. However, when that tree or plant dies, it decomposes and puts all that carbon back up into the atmosphere, either in the form of CO2 or sometimes also methane if there's moisture present. So as Shannan pointed out, if we could convert a portion of that biomass into carbon and sequester that carbon, then effectively we're pulling CO2 out of the atmosphere and sequestering it back in the soil. We're returning it to the earth. And that is really what our mission is here at VGrid. We're a carbon negative energy company. So with that, let me go to the next slide. So we produce the clean renewable energy. You'll see on this slide, it's a pretty busy slide, but a couple of things to point out. First and foremost, we have our gasifier, which is in a mobile, fairly compact trailer. That's about a 20-foot long trailer. And then we have a genset, which can take the syngas produced by the gasifier and turn that into electricity or heat. So in that genset, we have two Ford V10 truck engines with standard catalytic converters on them. So the emissions from those engines meet the California air quality standard, which is really some of the strictest in the country. And we produce electricity on demand. So you can run electricity 24/7 whenever you need it, whereas wind and solar are only when the sun shines and the wind blows. And then we produce biochar, or as we call it, biocarbon. And Shannan did a great job of pointing out all the benefits of that, so I won't dwell on that, except to say that we've been very active in the feed additive space. We have approval in California, Nebraska, and Alabama. We're in the process of getting FDA approval. And we've done some feed additive trials with calves in California and shown great results, with baby pigs in the panhandle of Texas and showed feed conversion efficiency as well as weight gain. And we're currently doing a trial with cows at the University of Nebraska where we'll be looking at feed conversion, weight gain, as well as methane reduction. The cows will be hooded and we'll be able to measure the actual methane produced. Our business model is that we remove any hurdle for a dairy farmer. So there's no upfront cost. You don't have to buy anything. You just provide the site and you provide the manure. And we bring in these mobile units, set them up on your dairy, connect them to your grid, and we can take that manure, generate electricity, and we will sell you back the electricity at a discount to what you're currently paying the utility. The only way we can do that is by monetizing the carbon. So the profit we can make from the carbon allows us to cover the cost of running those machines and giving you a cheaper electricity. So let me go to the next slide. Let me talk briefly about how gasification works. Shannan talked about pyrolysis. Let me just talk briefly about gasification. So this is the inside of that gasifier trailer. And you'll notice on the right with the dotted lines around it, that's the actual gasifier. It is an airtight vacuum vessel. So we suck all of the air out of it. The biomass is loaded into the hopper at the end of the trailer there, and it's augered up through a load lock into the very top orange section of the gasifier. It's gravity fed down into the gasification region. The gasification region introduces air, and hence oxygen, which allows partial combustion. And as Shannan said, we don't add a lot of oxygen. So it's about 20% of stoichiometric. That combustion reaction produces a lot of heat. It's exothermic. That's why you feel heat when you sit around the campfire. And we get temperatures in that combustion zone of up to 1,300 degrees centigrade. By not giving it all the oxygen it needs, you're left with a lot of carbon, very hot carbon. And so as that hot carbon drops below the combustion zone, it enters what we call the reduction zone. And this is a very critical part of the gasifier. This is where the combustion byproducts of CO2 and water vapor are converted into hydrogen and carbon monoxide. Those gases are combustible and can be fed into the engine to make electricity. And as that carbon sits in that reduction zone, it becomes more and more porous the more those combustion products interact with that carbon. We can control the time spent in that reduction zone by our activated grate mechanism at the bottom of the gasifier. And then finally, carbon comes out the bottom of the grate and is augured out into a super sac next to the gasifier. Next slide. I can cover this very quickly because Shannon did a great job on this. Big differences here are pyrolysis consumes energy. You need to put energy in to heat up the biomass, whereas gasification actually produces energy because it's an exothermic combustion reaction. No oxygen is used with pyrolysis. We introduce a little bit of oxygen through the air. You can see there the temperature differences. Shannon did point out that the yield, the amount of char as a percent of the biomass, tends to be higher, and that is correct. Next slide. So the biocarbons are very important to make the whole business model work, and they'll be important for a whole bunch of different applications, and I won't spend time going into those because I think Shannon did a great job covering that. But what I want to touch on here is the porosity, the large surface area. We produce 400 meters square per gram in some cases, and that's your sponge that absorbs odors or toxins or water. So let's go to the next slide. What I want to focus on here is what I call manure management solution for a dairy. We're currently operating at a dairy in Central Valley, California. It's actually a 2,000 cow dairy, but I use 200 cows here because it fits with one single gasifier that I've shown you earlier. And I apologize right away because I made an error on that amount of manure in gallons per day. That should be 2,800 instead of 1,400. But 200 cows produce 2,800 gallons per day of manure. That goes into a lagoon for storage. And if you look at the dry portion of the solid matter, that's about 2,800 pounds per day coming out. As Shannon mentioned, manure has very high moisture content, so it needs to be dried. We then pelletize it as well and put it in the gasifier. And so in a single day of operation, which would be about 14 hours, we can generate 1,500 kilowatt hours of electricity and 600 pounds of biochar. And if we take a portion of that biochar and put it back in the lagoon, as Shannon pointed out, we can absorb ammonia, hydrogen sulfate, and methane. And the ammonia absorption is very important because typical lagoons lose 50 to 80% of their nitrogen through ammonia formation and evaporation. So if we can trap that nitrogen and put that nitrogen back in the soil, it makes that manure a much better fertilizer. So let me go to the next slide. This was an early trial that we did at the dairy. We typically run pistachio shell at that dairy because we can get it for free. There's a nearby processing plant that produces large amounts of waste shell. The advantage of the shell is the very, very low moisture content. They have very, very low ash. And so they're easy to handle, easy to manage. And if we want to do further things like activate it for a water filter or an air purifier, they're much easier further activated because of the low ash. And you can see there, the manure pellets, we were able to get them dry just in the sun. In California, we have that in abundance in the summertime to 7%. You can see the much higher ash content in the manure itself. But the calorific value, if it were dry, is actually larger than the pistachio shell. And if you look at the biochar and the electricity produced, you can see two things. One, pistachio gives you actually more energy per kilogram than the manure, but you produce less char, so 12% biomass. So the carbon is being converted more into syngas, which gives you the more energy. And the moisture is lowering the combustion temperature for the manure, which is why you get less syngas, less electricity, but more char. Let me go to the next slide. Now, if we compare the gas between the two, you can see that the manure produces less combustion gas. Hydrogen is about the same, but CO is noticeably lower and CH4 is noticeably lower. But the good news is the char itself is actually comparable, except for the ash. So the density is about the same. The BET, which is the surface area, in this case, was 278 meters squared per gram. And even though the ash is high, if we're going to put it back in the lagoon and then put it in the soil, it's good ash, as Shannan said. It's got potassium and phosphor in it. And by trapping the nitrogen from the ammonia evaporation, we will also be nitrogen rich. So let me go to the next slide. So results, we've successfully demonstrated the feasibility of processing manure in generating electricity in biochar. We generated 0.19 kilowatt hours per kilogram of biosolid with about a 28% char. The ash from the feedstock shows the presence of nutrients which are beneficial for plant growth. And so based on this, we should be able to improve on our electricity production efficiency by further reducing the moisture content. Next slide. And this just shows you the advancement in the technology. We've been working on this for quite a long time. In the upper right-hand corner, you'll see our very first prototype, which actually used a John Deere diesel engine in an almond orchard, providing power to pump a deep well irrigation pump and the surface pumps from the storage pond. We then developed 6 second-generation bioservers. We put them at 2 different dairies, 3 on one, 3 on another. And then that led to the final release product. And we now have 5 bioservers installed. You can see a pictorial of that in the bottom right. And 3 more are being installed in the next 3 months. And we've worked to fully automate the operation of those machines. So with that, I'll go to my last slide and conclude. So in summary, we've developed field-proven mobile gasification technology that can produce low-cost, on-demand renewable electricity. We've developed valuable biocarbon products that have been tested and accepted in the market. We've verified that you can use manure as a feedstock, but I will stress we don't have a lot of data on that in terms of doing it day in, day out. It was really just a quick test, which produces biochar with good surface area and important soil nutrients. And then finally, our technology is environmentally friendly in producing renewable clean energy while reducing and removing harmful gases which can cause climate change. Thank you.
Thanks, Greg. Really interesting. So our last speaker today is Steve McCorkle. He is the CEO of a company called Ag Waste Solutions, also working with dairy in California, but they are converting dairy manure into jet fuel. So Steve, I'll let you tell your story.
Thank you, Kathleen. So yes, I'm Steve McCorkle, founder and CEO of Ag Waste Solutions, or AWS. I want to thank Kathleen and IBI for the opportunity to talk to you today about producing carbon-negative jet fuel as a value-added co-product of producing biochar from dairy manure. That's me in the upper right photo explaining the biofuel production process to a group of visitors. The upper left photo shows the Scott Brothers Dairy Farm in Southern California, our current host site for biochar and biofuels production. Scott Brothers milks about 1,100 Holsteins and farms about 700 acres of land for animal feed. The lower left photo shows the AWS microbial refinery at Scott Brothers with the pyrolysis unit on the right, the biofuels production unit in the middle, and part of the water treatment system on the left. The lower right photo shows the carbon-negative biochar and Fischer-Tropsch products. Fischer-Tropsch, or FT, is the type of process we use to create the jet fuel. And you'll note how clear and clean the FT diesel fuel is in the photos on the left in comparison to the petroleum diesel fuel on the right. FT diesel or jet fuel properly produced is always of the same high quality, regardless of the feedstock. And dairy manure is an exceptionally good feedstock for producing FT jet fuel, the cleanest burning jet fuel on the planet, because it's very consistent in its chemical makeup from day to day on dairies that have a nutritionist who controls the animal's diet. Next slide, please. This shows the AWS milestone history. I'm only going to mention some of the bolded items, starting with 2009. and obtaining the first full operating permit for biomass pyrolysis from the South Coast Air Quality Management District in Southern California, well recognized as one of the, if not the most stringent air district in the world. It's relatively simple to obtain an R&D permit from South Coast or from the San Joaquin Valley Air District in the Central Valley of California, but obtaining a full commercial operating permit is extremely difficult in these two air districts. In 2013, we obtained the first South Coast permits for manure pyrolysis plus biofuels production and enabled 26 dairies in the Western Riverside County Ag Coalition to renew their CAFO operating permits for another 5 years. In 2015, we produced the first ever sulfur-free Fischer-Tropsch or FT diesel and jet fuel from manure. And in 2016, we were invited to the White House to accept an EPA Nutrient Recycling Challenge Award for our work with manure-derived biochar and biofuels. In 2021, we will commercialize our carbon regeneration center and microbial refinery model for jet fuel and biochar production. Next slide, please. The major issue and opportunity we want to focus on today is that of the fact that aviation and agriculture together contribute about 13% of global greenhouse gas emissions. Biochar is certainly a viable solution for the ag part, and I'm not going to be talking about the biochar part today. However, biochar production is expensive when the co-products produced are of low or no value from the roughly 50% of the carbon that is still contained in the syngas of biochar production. Aviation in general as an industry has a huge issue in reducing their carbon footprint. So aviation travel emits the highest greenhouse gas emissions per passenger mile of any form of travel. It's about 4 times that of automobile travel. Serious ozone damage can occur at the higher altitudes due to the sulfur in the jet fuel, plus the aerosol formation from the jet engine designs. This is one of the reasons, or one of the concerns, that grounded the Concorde fleet of jets traveling at very high altitudes and supersonic speeds. The aviation industry really has no way to reasonably obtain carbon neutrality by 2050. They're not going to go to electric or hydrogen planes, probably in our lifetime, not the big aircraft anyway. And so they're somewhat unique in that they don't have any way to achieve carbon neutrality except for carbon negative jet fuel. So that's really what we're talking about here, comparing it to desulfurizing petroleum jet fuel, which actually increases CO2 equivalent emissions. Petroleum jet fuel refineries really can't meet the emission standards in California and increasingly in other regions without carbon offsets. So a viable solution is to regenerate carbon emissions from a high greenhouse gas emissions feedstock, like manure, it's one of the highest in the world, into carbon negative jet fuel and biochar. So we plan to utilize next generation graphene-based technologies to economically produce the lowest carbon intensity jet fuel and the resulting highest low carbon fuel standards, LCFS credits here in California, at the lowest possible cost, resulting in the highest value co-product of producing biochar. Next slide. This slide shows the AWS carbon regeneration cycle on a dairy farm. I'll just spend a minute on this. At position 1 at the top, you see the cows feeding on the food crops partially grown on the farm using manure-derived biochar. Going around the cycle clockwise, the cows excrete the manure. The liquids are separated from the solids. The solids are fed into the pyrolysis system to produce biochar and biosyngas. The syngas is conditioned to produce the jet fuel and parasitic power for the site. The conditioned syngas is converted into sulfur-free jet fuel and or diesel fuel and wax. And the liquid diesel fuel can power the farm equipment that harvests the crops grown with the biochar. The wax is sold to an FAA-certified jet fuel refinery for the final refining and FAA certification process. And then the closed-loop zero-waste carbon regeneration cycle begins again. Next slide. This slide shows the basic inputs and outputs of each stage of the AWS process, as well as the product and profit options. I'm not going to go through the inputs and outputs, but instead let's look at this blue box entitled Multiple Carbon Negative Product and Profit Options. The first point is that the nutrient-rich biochar, manure biochar plus the jet fuel provides profit flexibility with market variations for the two main products. I should point out here that our primary products of biochar and jet fuel in the form of wax have indefinite shelf lives, a major advantage in balancing production versus inventory forecast, especially for our offtake partners. The process also produces fertigation water, potable water if needed, and parasitic power for the system, all of which reduce the carbon footprint of the operation by reducing or eliminating the external purchases and carbon. The process can also convert anaerobic digester biogas, landfill gas, or any type of flare gas into jet fuel. The system can work alongside of a digester. I think Shannon mentioned this as well, to convert the greater than 50% of the manure carbon that remains in the digestate into biochar and jet fuel, converting the digestate liability into revenues and profits. Areas that are too far remote from the major gas and electricity grid backbones of the networks to sell their biogas or electricity to the utilities, which constitutes most of the areas in California and elsewhere, can easily transport the jet fuel and biochar products to market without depending on the utility companies. Projects scale up by adding portable, standardized modules operating in parallel, either on a single site or dispersed amongst several sites. You can see that our project financial goal is to have an earnings before income and taxes, return on capital employed, which is called ROCE, of greater than 20%. Next slide, please. So I'm going to quickly review how high greenhouse gas emission feedstocks like dairy manure can be converted into high low carbon fuel standard credits for the carbon negative transportation fuel. So this slide shows a 20% CI reduction, carbon intensity reduction target for fuels in California by 2030. The standard pathway and carbon intensity is set for each type of fuel, and the state does this, CARB does this, California Air Resources Board, depending on its life cycle, what they call well to wheels for transportation fuels, carbon analysis. And that CI ratchets down every year towards this 2030 goal. Fuels with CIs above the standard, the line here, generate deficits, and fuels with CIs below the standard generate credits. And of course, we plan to generate substantial credits with our manure-derived jet fuel. Next slide. This slide depicts some of the businesses on the left that sell fuels with CIs above the cap for their fuel type and must consequently purchase credits in order to reach compliance with this 20% goal. The examples on the right depict businesses that sell fuels with CIs below the cap that can sell credits. And I should point out here that fuels must be transported to California to qualify for LCFS credits, and jet fuel is easily transported to California from anywhere in the world to obtain these credits. Much easier than transporting gas and other materials. Next slide, please. Each fuel type has a range of carbon intensity scores as shown in this graph. Markers represent the CI score for certified fuel pathways, and the length of each bar represents the range of CI scores that can be achieved by each fuel type. So these CI scores are developed based on life cycle analysis with scores that vary due to feedstock type, origin, raw material, processing efficiencies, fuel used in the transportation method, and the transportation method itself. Lower CI scores are more favorable because they are the cleanest life cycle solutions and therefore earn the highest LCFS credit values. So I've drawn in a forecasted CI value for FT jet fuel from dairy manure. You can see it there in the middle in green. It's about minus 410, and this is an estimate on our point because the pathway doesn't yet exist. But FT jet fuel is, like I mentioned before, is the cleanest burning jet fuel on the planet. And if you look at the CI standards on the right for FT diesel fuel, you see that it's positive 15 as compared to petroleum diesel fuel, which is somewhere right around plus 100. So the FT jet fuel can be produced from a variety of feedstocks. However, manure is the most carbon negative feedstock, as evidenced by this minus 287 carbon intensity in the bolded diamond for the bio-CNG category. So we believe that this FT jet fuel will have a CI of less than minus 400, producing the highest LCFS credits and the highest fuel sales of any transportation fuel in the LCFS system. Next slide. I'm sure most of you have seen this carbon cycle and biochar cycle depictions shown here, with roughly 50% of the pyrolysis carbon output going into the biochar product and 50% going into the syngas. It compels us to convert that 50% carbon in the syngas to its highest and best value end use. The carbon intensity of petroleum jet fuel is about positive 100. And the CI of our jet fuel, like I mentioned before, will be somewhere around minus 400. So burning manure-derived jet fuel removes about 4 times the greenhouse gas emissions that burning petroleum jet fuel adds. So that means that the net carbon drawdown of AWS manure-derived jet fuel as compared to petroleum jet fuel is about 500%. Next slide. So why is the AWS service solution unique? So first of all, we have an economically viable build, own, and operate solution for animal farms with a profit-sharing program for host sites to help drive profitability, shared profitability goals. We offer the most carbon negative and most profitable dual revenue solution from biochar production. We locate these micro biorefineries at the feedstock source, eliminating the highest cost of biofuels production, which is the transportation of the feedstock to the central plant. Our offtake products are energy dense, volume reduced, reducing offtake transportation costs and increasing market reach. Being permitted in South Coast means that we can be permitted basically anywhere. And our closed loop, zero waste micro biorefineries can be completely independent of utility company grids. AWS's graphene-based gas to liquid technology offers the highest conversion rates of syngas to jet fuel of any system known, with high automation in terms of running it and very low OPEX for the F2 jet fuel part of the equation. So the dairy model, this dairy model will work alongside current digester systems as well to convert that 50% of carbon that's still left behind for the farmer to deal with into jet fuel and biochar, solving a lot of the problems that the farmers typically have with the digestate. And a distributed micro biorefinery model works well for both large and small dairy clusters. Next slide, please. So that's it. Thank you very much for your time and attention, and I look forward to your questions and comments.
Thanks, Steve. So we have a number of questions that I'm going to try to get through, most of them. And I fed some already to our presenters so they could prepare. But some of them might still be a little bit out of scope of kind of our panel's expertise. The first one I think might qualify for that. The question is, considering 90% moisture content of manure, what are your views about hydrothermal carbonization as an alternative technology? Are the thermodynamics of HTC more favorable than pyrolysis? So I'm going to open that up to any of you. HTC is not very common in the US, but do any of you have any experience or exposure to that?
I do not. So.
Okay. I'm going to take the silence from Greg and Steve as they don't either. What I will say is my limited knowledge of HTC, there is a university in New York City working on it, and they have done some soil trials, I want to say in Italy, and I've spoken to various Europeans that are working with HTC, as well as the European biochar industry. They have excluded HTC specifically from the biochar definition because they have found that it is not passing the standards for safety of a biochar. So that's as much as I know. I'm by no means an expert, but that might help. So another question for Shannan. Do you fear biochar poured in liquid manure to block odors could absorb ammonia, but also increase emissions of methane in open lagoons? Or are there studies proving that that's not the case?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I will also mention the caveat that some studies have found biochar added to slurries and lagoons reduces ammonia emissions, and then others have found that it really doesn't do much. So that's a caveat. You can read more about that in the synthesis report. And in terms of methane emissions from lagoons, when biochar was added, the research is lacking. So I don't really have a good answer for that. There's not any rigorous or good research that talks about what happens with methane emissions. But that could be a concern because obviously it does, as I mentioned, help with the methane production during anaerobic digestion. So that's an area of research that needs to be explored more, I think.
Yeah, I totally agree. And the next couple of questions are on methane as well. And it is interesting how it reduces methane generation in some areas, like with cows, and boosts it in other areas, like in anaerobic digesters. So the following question is, are there any figures on how much biochar reduces methane output from cows generally? What's the difference? Oh, sorry, that's the next question. So I can answer that if you don't have that off the top of your head.
I don't. Yeah, you go for it.
So from the research, I worked on a meta-analysis which was published in 2019 looking at feed char research, and it's quite variable, as biochar is in many different end uses, but often it depends on what kind of animal you're feeding, what other part of their diet is included. It can vary from not much to, I doubt it's ever going to be 30%. So I think there's a lot more research that could be done here. Right now, there's no financial incentive for a farmer to buy biochar for methane reduction. There's no methodology that measures that and then pays them to do it. And I would say that's not going to happen until we have more peer-reviewed research on that topic. So the next question is generally, what's the difference in the period of sequestration of carbon of pyrolyzed versus gasified feedstock? Greg or Steve, do you want to take a crack at that?
This is Greg. The only thing I can say is that there was the discovery of terra preta in the Amazon, which was carbon dated to 1,500 years. So the Indian population in that region used to make clay pottery by essentially building a fire and heating it up in the presence of very little oxygen or no oxygen in order to make the pots. And then they put that remaining hot carbon in the soil. And so that shows you that type of biochar can last for a very long time.
Yeah, and often it's correlated to the temperature. So gasification tends to take place at much higher temperatures, and so your HC ratio tends to be higher the hotter it's cooked. So I think that might be more of a correlation than whether it's pyrolysis versus gasification, but I can't say I've actually read papers specifically on that question.
Yeah, I haven't, but yeah, anecdotally, I would say that, like you mentioned, Kathleen, at slightly lower temperatures, and I'm sure this happened at shorter timescales than the Terra Preta example, you're gonna have more or less stable carbon, but higher temperatures, it will be more stable for a longer period of time.
Mm-hmm. So a question on whether someone can speak to the cycle of heat in the pyrolysis process. Specifically, you need an initial heat source, and then the heat generated being used to dry feedstock. How does that affect the economics and the energy usage? That's a very technical question.
Yeah, I would say, so for that biomass controls example specifically, they do have to use, as Steve mentioned, when you're doing pyrolysis versus gasification, pyrolysis requires some energy input. But that said, this specific biomass controls machine, not that I'm promoting them specifically, the other machines are probably similar, uses very, very, very little energy, like 6 kilowatt hours or something a day, like basically having a light bulb on for half a day. So it requires some energy, but then the drying process can actually be facilitated by the pyrolysis itself, because I slightly misspoke. I said it creates the energy to dry the manure initially, but it creates heat, not energy. It creates heat to dry the manure down to the point where it can be pyrolyzed. And that process for this specific machine requires, about the amount of a light bulb.
Yeah, and the amount of excess energy is directly correlated to how wet the feedstock is and how much heat you need to dry it. So, in the case of manure and sewage sludge, you're probably not going to have a lot of excess after drying that to the level needed. But when you're using a drier feedstock, as Greg's machine is doing with shells, then you obviously have all this excess heat, which can be used to generate heat and electricity. So a question on what's the typical yield from manure? I'm sure we're all going to have slightly different answers, but Steve and Greg, do you want to answer that?
Do you mean biochar yield as a percent of biomass?
Yes.
Yeah, so with the manure, I think I showed in my presentation, it was about 30%.
And Steve, I think yours was a little less than that.
No, mine's a little bit more than that. And again, it's depending on the dryness of the material coming in, the manure coming in. So we use a pre-dryer in order to get it down to about 20% moisture content. But we get about a 35% yield of biochar out versus manure volume in, manure mass.
Oh, okay, that's interesting. I know on the biomass controls, they use a much higher, the volume reduction is quite high, but they start from the wet biomass and not the dry. So is anyone focusing on manufacturing of the equipment needed to be operational? I think we've covered that one. How much initial capital is needed to get started, economies of scale? I think you both mentioned that you have an owner operate model. Is that right? If you want to provide any additional details on that, this would be a good time.
No, that's correct. So go ahead.
No, you go ahead.
I was going to say that's our model, is that we don't want to create a hurdle for the farmer. So we own the machine, we operate the machine, and we sell electricity as a service. and then we monetize the biocarbon to make it all work.
So we have the same kind of model, build, own, operate type of model. So we provide the capital for the project. And as I mentioned, our financial goal is to have an EBIT, return on capital employed, of greater than 28%. That requires a fairly large project. In terms of dairy manure, that would be about 4 tons of manure in to create about 20 barrels per day of jet fuel. But again, we'll finance that, and then we give the site host, the farmer, the option to participate in the financing of the project in return for a higher profit sharing percentage. But this is not a system that farmers would typically want to go out and buy, and certainly not one that they would want to operate with farm staff, because that's not their main métier, so to speak. Their job is producing milk and dairy products. So it's a complicated system. Our system is, for sure, with the jet fuel part, and so we don't want the farmer to have to finance or operate any part of that, but they are welcome to invest in the project and share a higher percentage of the profits.
Yeah, and I'll add, I've talked to, on the NYSERDA project I briefly mentioned, I talked to Greg and a few different people who have very different business models. So I think the sort of dairy industry biochar realm is open to a lot of different economic business models, depending on if a farm wants to buy or lease, or just have like a cooperative or this or that. So I think there's a lot of options. It's just unfortunately not out in the open as much because it's sort of a new upcoming technology.
Yeah. So we have a bunch of other questions. Caroline, I don't know if we can extend for another 5 minutes, but I'm going to keep plowing through. I do need a few minutes at the end, though. One of the questions was, I know we're talking about dairy, but will these technologies discussed today work with other types of manures, such as from wild animals or hogs or poultry?
I'll take a whack at that. The answer is yes. So we've done work with pig farms, and I did a lot of work in North Carolina State University. They had the largest animal waste technology evaluation program with the Smithfield project, it was called. And, pig manure makes very good biochar and jet fuel as well. Beef manure does. There are a few challenges about beef manure because the animals live in the same confined area for typically for the last 4 months of their life. So you have to kind of keep the manure alive in order to get a good biochar product. But there are ways to do that actually with biochar. But the answer is yes. Any and all confined animals and feeding operations would be good candidates for these kind of projects.
We're actually working in the Lehmann Lab right now on a project focused on poultry litter and biochar. So yeah, I think the overall answer, like Steve said, is yes to all of that. Even human waste too can be thermochemically converted. Yep.
Okay, there was a question saying carbon, charcoal, and biochar has been specifically delisted or banned for animal feed in the U.S. by the AFFCO. Is IBI considering taking any steps to reverse this? What research have you? Oh, sorry, that's the next one. So Derek, this is true, but I will say, as Greg mentioned, the state of California and I believe Nebraska and Alabama at a state level have allowed it. This is probably one of the biggest focuses for the U.S. biochar industry in terms of getting that reversed. And I will tell you that in the U.S., Tom Miles has been part of the Biden transition team looking at bioenergy and biochar, and they were asking what kind of policies would help promote the industry, and that's kind of the number one on our list. So we hope so. There's been a few researchers working directly with the FDA on this to demonstrate that it is safe. So as far as the California regulations go, that it's there. All it says right now is it has to be 60% or more carbon content, but I think it is incumbent on the U.S. Biochar Initiative to create a standard that works for feed char. So I think we'll start to see that later on this year.
Yeah, if I could add to that, B-Grid
Yep.
is in the process of getting approval from the FDA. We petitioned to be approved as a feed additive supplement. We had to submit a whole bunch of data for grass, generally regarded as safe, and then they required that we would do an efficacy test of mycotoxin binding, which we did in a lab with phosphate buffer, but they came back and said you have to follow a FDA-approved protocol. So we got a protocol approved to mix it with feed, and now that test is being undertaken to show mycotoxin binding. If we can prove efficacy, my hope is the FDA will approve it as a feed additive supplement and we can get it back on the AFCO list.
So I want to mention quickly that dairy manure biochar cannot be fed back to the animals. I don't know if anybody was unclear on that, but in general,
Yeah.
you know.
And maybe let me be clear that we're using pistachio shell biochar to get approval.
Right, that's fine.
Yeah, no, Shannon had mentioned that. I think she just misspoke. So
Yeah. That's why I tried to correct myself and say like, oh, or what are these materials? But yeah, I think some regions in the world have experimented with that in Europe, but yeah, obviously not very common. And I don't think that would likely happen here.
right. Greg, have you found states receptive to permitting biochars for feed? I know you just addressed that, but you were the first person I've heard mention that beyond California, you had these two other states. Is that because in Nebraska and Alabama, they too created it, or was it a one-on-one application situation?
It was we went state by state one-on-one, and a lot of states require you to go FDA, but some states can make their own independent assessment. So Nebraska formed a grass committee of experts, and we had to submit a lot of data and answer a lot of questions, and they made the recommendation that it be accepted. So we can use it as a feed additive in the state of Nebraska. Alabama just accepted the application, but the other states require FDA approval.
Okay. There's a question on jet fuel. Does your process produce jet A1 or just the FT wax to be converted to jet fuel and diesel by others? Steve?
Sorry, I was muted there. Can you hear me now?
Yep.
Okay. The answer to the question is that any type of jet fuel has to be sent to an FAA certified jet fuel refinery or a refinery that has jet fuel FAA certification capabilities in order for the kind of the final polishing required. Now the jet fuel that we produce, even from manure, and like I mentioned, manure is actually a very good feedstock for producing this because of its chemical consistency, is 95% refined as it is. So refineries love to get a hold of all of the products, not just the Jet A or Jet B, but the diesel fuel and any other type of liquids that come along with the jet fuel in the liquid form, because they can use these sulfur-free fuel types to dilute the sulfur content of their petroleum-based fuel. It's very, very expensive to desulfurize fuel. I think I mentioned that in a refinery. I mentioned that in the presentation. So if they can add this sulfur-free fuel from our process or any similar Fischer-Tropsch process, they can bring that sulfur level down at a much lower cost. So what we're trying to do is get the most jet fuel out of the combined liquid and wax products. So that's why I spoke about our high conversion rate to wax, because we're looking for more wax than fuel, because the wax can be cracked into any type of associated fuel by the refinery. Jet A, Jet B, Diesel 1, Diesel 2, kerosene, naphtha, any of these type of fuels. So it allows them much more flexibility in their refining, and they'll pay more for the wax than they'll pay for the fuel on a comparative volume basis.
Interesting. So I'm only going to take one last question, even though there were a few more. We may be able to get some additional responses if Caroline can capture all the questions. But this is a money question. How much money can a farmer expect to receive if he has 10,000 cows on his farm with either of these systems? Is it really revenue, or is it cost savings? I'll ask that to Greg and Steve.
That's a good question.
So in the case of eGrid, it would be cost savings on the electricity.
Mm-hmm.
So in the case of AWS, it would be revenues from the profit sharing of the project, depending on whether or not he or she invested in the project. So if they don't invest in the project and just supply the site and the manure, they'll still get a profit sharing percentage, but it will be smaller than the amount that would be commensurate with their investment. Should they, say, if they invested 50% of the funds required for the project, they might receive 50% of the profit proceeds. And so that's it. It's a profit sharing type of revenue, direct revenue sharing, pass through on taxes and that kind of thing on the legal entity.
Excellent.
I'll say,
yeah.
Can I add one last thing? So we have a proposal in the works still, Kathleen, you know about this with NYSERDA, where we're trying to do an economic analysis of on-farm pyrolysis of dairy manure, and it would look at everything from A to Z that could possibly cost or save money. And our initial sort of analysis proposal is suggesting that if there are carbon credits and if you take into account odor reduction and some of the other benefits I mentioned, it could ultimately be a cost saving technology for farmers. But we need to do more research, I think. All right.
And that's not an owner operate. That's the farmer buying the equipment, right, Shannon?
Right, leasing. Yeah. So it would be the farmer would be leasing the equipment. We would, during this research phase, we would be leasing it for them. That's part of the funding for 3 years. But ultimately, it would be researching like, okay, if a farmer were to lease or buy equipment and own it, yeah. So a different business model again, what would the economic balance be?
So we'll find out, hopefully. Well, I just want to thank all three of you for helping put together this today. I think it was really helpful, and hopefully the dairy industry is going to begin to adopt some or all of these processes in the near future. Caroline, next slide, please. I just wanted to give folks a heads up on some of the coming attractions for IBI. James and I are working on lining up the next few webinars. We are hoping to bring you speakers from the world of viticulture, stormwater management, and a little bit more about livestock feed, because that's such a hot topic. I'm getting a lot of inquiries about study tours. As you know, we didn't do one last year, but I've done them for 3 years prior to that. And with the hope of a vaccine rolling out, we are tentatively planning for this year. The folks that were going to host one in Tuscany this year are hoping to host one in the fall. And I am hoping to lead at least one study tour, if not two, sorry. One will possibly be in Norway and the other in the US later this year. All of that is conditional on constraining COVID, of course. I mentioned the roundtables already, and new ones will be announced in our newsletters. One last thing I'm hoping that we'll be launching is a competition on brief biochar broadcasts. Think 2-minute videos, animations, or other mediums that help tell the biochar story to different audiences. So get your creative juices flowing and stay tuned for more details. Next slide. For any of you that joined us today that are not yet IBI members, we would love to have you become IBI members, and to encourage that, we offer the opportunity to flip your one-time payment into a professional membership if that's done by the end of the month. And just as a reminder, you should receive a short survey after today's webinar, and if you fill that out, it helps us to continue to improve the series and plan for future topics. So thanks to everybody for joining in today and for your continued support of IBI. Stay safe and hope to have you join us again in the future. Bye.